Hello and good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome to part one of Defending the Defense Industrial Base Webinar Ensemble series. Part one features Tom Cornelius from Compliance Forge and Derek White from Beryllium InfoSec. They will be discussing cybersecurity documentation requirements for CMMC and affordable and practical CMMC strategies for the DIB. After that, we'll have a short open forum Q&A, which will be moderated by Levi from NeQter Labs, and then we'll wrap everything up. We have a lot of information to cover today, so at this time, I'm going to turn things right over to Tom.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Cornelius. I'm going to take a slightly different take on compliance documentation, just to kind of show you really a different way to use as an active tool. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background on myself. I'm the senior partner at Compliance Forge, also the founder of the Secure Controls Framework. Former military, also done Fortune 100 companies in the governance, risk, and compliance space. And I'm also one of the contributors to the CMMC Center of Awesomeness. If you haven't found that, it's worth making a cup of coffee and checking it out. Next slide, please. So the point of this presentation is really about your documentation being able to tell a story. A lot of people overlook, documentation is really half the battle when it kind of comes to compliance, and it's usually kind of viewed as a passive defense, not really that important until you actually get to an assessment or some type of audit. So your documentation really kind of comes down to having the need to tell a compelling story. Your documentation will tell a story either way. Are you, is it an adventure? Or did you overcome a bunch of odds? Or is it essentially Dumb and Dumber, where it's essentially an embarrassing comedy? This is where you really need to take a look at how your documentation is going to be overall presented. Next slide, please. Because the biggest thing is focus on the mission. You have to understand what your mission is in your assessment, and that is to demonstrate minimum security requirements, or MSR. And that means that every requirement that you have, in the case of CMMC, essentially all 110 CUI controls from 800-171 and the additional 20 controls from similar practices from CMMC, have documentation to show that essentially, that you're tall enough to ride the ride. That's really what the assessor wants to find. The wrong approach is your assessor shows up and you wait for them to start asking questions. One, it's an absolute field day for an assessor to sit there, make camp and just bill up, endless hours asking you question after question. The correct approach is to take the initiative, and essentially this is where you set the battlefield by not only having documentation available, but you're gonna think of it this way: they temporarily work for you. You're going to start off, tell them to sit, listen, learn, and you're going to essentially walk them through all your documentation, give it to them on a silver platter that supports the story that you want to tell. So you control the narrative on this, and that's the way that you really kind of need to think of your mission. Your documentation needs to stay on target and focus on the mission. Next slide, please. So just a couple little side notes is that everyone should understand compliance is not the same thing as security. And this is where you really do need to take the time to educate your stakeholders that if they just focus on these minimum requirements, it's going to be overall poor security. If you read 800-171 CMMC, all that it really cares about is confidentiality, integrity. Confidentiality and integrity has nothing to do with availability. So CMMC really doesn't do a great amount in the overall supply chain risk management, just confidentiality, integrity. People need to understand that. The other thing is, don't try to impress the assessor with how secure your organization is. It has nothing to do with the assessment. The assessor only cares about, are you tall enough to ride? Are you compliant? Next slide, please. So something to understand: people get wrapped around the axle. Is it a practice? Is it a process? Is it control? In practical terms, a control is essentially the power to influence or direct behaviors in the course of events. These are your technical, administrative, and physical safeguards. So, in essence, CMMC practices and processes are controls. You get a lot of people just, again, they get caught up in the wording, but we're talking controls. Next slide. So one of the best resources out there to really understand, how you actually manage controls is the common criteria model. And the premise of this is simply that if your controls are sufficient, then that is going to counter any type of threats to the assets and data. So essentially, if you look at the graphic, you see asset owners implement controls to reduce risk, and asset owners wish to minimize risk because they value the data. That's the type of stuff you need to kind of think through, because the assumptions are that if your controls are correct and do what they claim to do, that risk is going to be appropriately essentially mitigated. So this is when you start doing your own internal, assessments of controls, prior to actually getting a third-party assessment to come out. You need to look and see, do these controls that we have in place, do they, minimize the risk accordingly, so that it meets the intent of 800-171 and CMMC. Next slide. So the other thing to keep in mind is this concept of due care and due diligence. So this is very important from the compliance side of things. It's a two-sided coin. So when you think of due diligence, you're thinking, you have your documented policies and standards, and you even have your documented procedures and other things like that. But the due care side is where a lot of companies fall down, is that they don't actually have the evidence to show, let's say you're doing quarterly scanning, or you're doing, essentially permission reviews, or you're doing, there's evidence of, log management. So you both need the documented evidence of what you are going to do, as well as the due care evidence to demonstrate that you actually did what you said you're going to do. And without, both sides of that coin, you're going to fail an assessment. Next slide. So one of the things that again, it's a different way of thinking from a CMMC and 800-171 perspective, is this data-centric security model. So you have to kind of view your network in the systems of systems concept that covers regulated data, be it FCI or CUI, wherever it is stored, transmitted, and processed throughout the entire data lifecycle. So even if something is new, it's not even coming into production yet. Are you using live data in there? Does that come into scope? You have to think through all the different places where it can exist. Next slide. So one of the probably best things you can do is just again, make a cup of coffee, go check out, you can see the link at the bottom of the page, the free CUI scoping guide. And that's going to essentially I'll walk you through a way to really help identify what is directly and indirectly influencing your CUI environment. That's something that you really need to have as a prerequisite to really properly prepare for an assessment. Next slide. So when you get down to telling the story of how to actually demonstrate compliance, this is really where you're telling the story of how people, processes, and technology are all coming together to fundamentally address NIST 800-171 alpha assessment criteria. That's what NARA has identified. That's what the AB and DoD are saying are going to be the core 110 controls that the assessment is going to be based off of. So the big thing is, if you don't explain it, like how this works, no one else is going to do it, and that's where you're going to learn, basically lose a very valuable advantage in the assessment process. So you must have documentation to tell your story that's going to include your standard policy, standards, and procedures. And from that perspective too, they need to be linked. So if you have an assessor who has to sit there and manually read through everything and really hunt and peck and try and find out where something is linked, it's going to be a very expensive assessment, because every minute they're sitting on sitting in your premise, they're going to be billing you. So this is where you want to have stuff that's very easy to essentially for them to find what they're looking for. You have to have your system security plan. You have to have your plan of action milestones, and I'll talk a little bit more about the SSP in a few minutes. But from the plan of action milestones, you need to have one to show also, what your journey has been. Hey, these are all the things we had to address, how we changed it, who owned it. But at this time, the current guidance on CMMC is that your poem has to be blank. Now, if DIBCAP comes audits you just under 800-171 alpha, or right now, you can have an SSP and POAM. But when it comes to CMMC time, your poem has to be blank. You also have to have asset inventories, network and data flow diagrams, and also an incident response plan. So this is something that, again, a lot of companies are really weak on. Next slide, please. This is something I'm not going to go into detail. You can download this on the bottom of the page. But again, make a cup of coffee, download this operational and cybersecurity planning document. This is really going to show you how, from your business planning, your objectives, your SOPs, how it works with individual contributors to create that evidence of due care and due diligence. Next slide. So I'm going to go over 3 different prerequisites that you really need to have. So this is where a lot of companies that I work with on a daily basis, they haven't even thought of. So your first step is you have to have the following 3 things: an accurate inventory of all systems, applications, and services, thinking back to that aspect of data-centric security, where it's essentially anywhere that CUI is stored, transmitted, and processed. A detailed network diagram that that identifies servers, firewalls, all, third parties, and also your data flow diagram that documents the flow from CUI all the way down to from the DoD all the way down to subs. So this is going to allow you to document your assessment boundary, and that's going to identify the scope of the assessment. This is where that's going to then go into your SSP. That it's essentially it needs to be crystal clear, because that's your core playbook that an assessor is going to use to wrap their heads around of what the assessment entails. Next slide. And again, you can download this from the CMMC scoping side. This is an example of what a good, clear network diagram and assessment boundary should look like. Next slide. Prerequisite number 2: if it is not documented, it doesn't exist. So a lot of people don't get that, but when it comes to an assessment, if you say you were working on it or if it's in draft, that's going to be a failure, because if it's not in production and it's not essentially fully documented from a compliance perspective, it doesn't exist and you'll fail. Next slide. And this is one thing where, again, once you get your documentation together, think of stakeholder involvement. It's not a single player activity. And this also includes not just other stakeholders within your company, but third-party service providers. So one person, from your company, dealing with a C3PO, could talk your policies and standards. One person can manage that. But when you really look at it from a procedures perspective, you're going to need to have those control owners and various stakeholders involved, and they'll probably be interviewed, because they're going to be subject matter experts on specifically what's happening. And one person with your company really needs to essentially own that SSP and tell that story of essentially the who, what, where, how, and why. So bringing all that together it will help you tell the story with your C3PO. That's all that I have. I'll be open for questions at the end.
Cool. Thank you, Tom, for that. That was well done. This is Derek White. I'm with Beryllium InfoSec Collaborative, and I'm going to transition my conversation. I'm going to piggyback off some of the stuff that Tom was mentioning. So thank you for that, Tom. That was really good information. I'm going to focus a little bit on affordable and practical strategies for the DIB, and we're going to put a little bit of a focus too on more of the smaller companies versus, say, enterprise, just based on some of the ways that we're helping clients. And I know a lot of people within this webinar and our community are along that same lines of actually helping out here. So thank you for joining today. And as was mentioned at the beginning, there's a Q&A section at the bottom of your webinar platform. Please use that, submit questions. We'll take some questions here at the end, and I think we'll have a pretty good amount of time to go back and forth between those of us that are in attendance. Next slide, please. So by now, hopefully, no matter what side of the fence you're sitting on within the CMMC and this 171 requirements, you're familiar with this set of control families, are now called domains of the CMMC, and where the requirements fall. And for some of those that are a little bit less informed on this versus those that are, it still comes down to the same thing. It's technology, it's administrative, and it's physical, altogether. Right? So there's certain things that technology is not going to do, and there's certain things that policy and procedure can't do if you don't have other things in place, as Tom clearly highlighted. Documenting and showing stuff of things that you don't have are going to be difficult to do. So a lot of times there's a couple different paths that people can take, organizations can take, who are trying to get the requirements in place, and that's doing it yourself, which is absolutely allowed, and using expertise from vendors or third parties to get it done as well. So today I'm going to kind of put our mindsets in a couple different spots just to show one practical and affordable kind of way for small business DIB customers to get into place. So the green boxes that you can see here are the domains that really focus more on technology. And whether it's a technology piece or it's a policy around the technology that has to be implemented, we're going to start with that first. Next slide, please. And you take those green boxes and you pull out the actual requirements that are labeled and discussed in the CMMC models in NIST 800-171. Yeah, don't try to read these one by one. This is kind of on purpose. You can see that there's a lot. It is a lot to do. But more importantly, some of these handle some more weight than others. So access control is a huge one, obviously. And maintenance is another one that's maybe it's important, but it doesn't require as much as, say, your system information and integrity. But the backbone of what NIST 800-171 is around the technology side falls within these requirements. And so although it's a lot, it is what the prescription is, right? So if we go to the next slide, please. So what if you as an organization were to take that prescription and throw it all into a system or a secure server for CUI only, right? That's the segmentation that they're asking for. So if you did that and you took all of those requirements from a technical aspect only and built up a system on that, that would solve a lot of problems. So now we're talking about separating your CUI from the rest of your network, where if it's flowing around, you're not sure where it's at, or maybe it's in some cloud configuration that you're not really 100% sure where it's at. That's where some small businesses can struggle. But the important thing there is this doable? Yes, businesses are doing this and have been doing this for a long time, and not even just with CUI. This is the payment card industry, so PCI, credit card information, healthcare information, the list goes on and on. So as far as a practical, doable, yes. Practical is kind of a sort of when you talk about a small business, because it depends on resources and internal resources, which is hard to put costs and time on. But from the affordable standpoint, that's kind of a maybe, because if you have the budget and you have the expertise, then you can make it affordable. But really, from a small business standpoint, the requirements that go that you can see just in that arrow alone is a lot. So that's where the affordability becomes a little bit different scenario. So next slide, please. So a way to kind of take the practical and affordable approach for a small business could be something like this, which is a virtual enclave or a virtual system, again, built up through the NIST 800-171 requirements, which really comes down to an on-premise solution, if you will. So rather than it sitting inside your facility as an on-prem, it could be residing somewhere else, in, say, a data center that is over the moon, meeting the requirements of what a physical protection is supposed to have. But importantly here, if you do this approach, scope matters. Scope is always going to matter, but really specifically around who touches this information, who actually needs to have access to this system is important. Now, it's sometimes hard to understand. That's where Tom was getting into data flow analysis and understanding when it comes into your organization and who handles it when it goes out. When is it inside of an infrastructure like an enclave or a system, and when is it not? That stuff, we'll get to that in a second. But really, the scope matters. So in this instance with the virtual enclave, let's say, everybody can access it the same way if you follow the prescription of NIST 800-171, whether you're in the office on your workstation on the left there or at home remotely. You're still accessing that virtual enclave through a remote desktop, right? And now very popular on the right, while we're all sitting and working remotely at home and people are adapting to the changes of teleworking, this becomes a more practical way of securing your CUI and not having it go to a perimeter scope of your devices and people who don't need access to it. And as Tom said, if you can't document it and you can't point to it, then you're going to fail. And we can't have that. So trying to take this big picture thing and pull it down to a more affordable and practical way is one way, and we'll talk more about that. Next slide, please. Because it comes down to, in our minds, really it comes down to control, infrastructure first. It's not the only thing, but it is called controlled unclassified information. Tom, you kind of highlighted this with one of your slides. If you can't identify where it's at and you don't know who's got it at all times and stuff, you can't control it. And if you can't control it, how are you expected to put requirements around it to meet what the DoD is asking you to do? So infrastructure is a big piece of it, right? And so if you have the right infrastructure built to the prescription, it works. NIST Standard 171 is a great security program when it's in place. So infrastructure matters because we have some people who have great infrastructure, but maybe it's not done, or maybe they started down the wrong path because they weren't really sure. Then things get a little messy. And if you go into, let's say a cloud configuration that maybe isn't done correctly, then can you really say that you're controlling it? Maybe, you're kind of relying on them at that point, et cetera. So it really comes down to that control factor first, again, back to scope and back to who actually needs this within your organization. And that falls on people within the business. Expertise can't really be telling you that you know your business better than anybody else. So start identifying that, really starts helping you plan how you're going to get this done. So next slide, please. So going back to the domains again, and these control families or requirements of how they're categorized, you start focusing, let's shift focus a little bit back to the blue. So now the blue boxes are things that technology is not going to do for you. It can't do for you. So how do we encompass the administrative and the physical control requirements alongside the technology? If, say, you're a small business who struggles to have the right budgets in place to hire the right people that can focus on both security and technical, or the infrastructure side, and do you use an MSP and all that stuff, this is where Tom was really highlighting a lot of this. This gets to be a difficult thing if you don't have the green boxes done. You can't really document and showcase something that's not in place. So we're going to talk about both of those a little bit together here. If we go to the next slide. I've kind of broke this out. This is typically an animated slide that I like to use, but we're going to put it on a static slide for this presentation. So I drew a clear line in red there, and everything on the left there that's around that that enclave, that secure system, are the green boxes. So think of it that way, where yes, there's encryption at rest and in transit. It's in that system. There's a SIEM that is monitoring that system at all times. Some of that stuff that Tom was talking about, that you can showcase that you're monitoring this thing, you're looking at it ongoing, etc. That's in there. Much easier to do when that's not your whole organization, say commercial business or non-DoD, or you're not sure where the CUI is. We're again segmenting and controlling. And multi-factor authentication is also in there as well. And that managed system now that resides virtually is built up using what vendors and partners we felt were really, or you as the business, but what we specifically felt were great for small businesses based on the affordability and practicality of implementation and usability and management, right? So that's all done in one place. That's great. And then that separation of duties, that red line, becomes very important with the NIST Standard 171. Little Johnny Two Shoes, who's building the system up by himself, you can give him an open checkbook if you want, and goes and builds up the system, can no longer say, yeah, it's good, I got it, everything's taken care of, trust me on this. DoD is not going to allow that anymore, and hasn't been for a while. So now we're talking about the physical and administrative side of the requirements. So the security administration, training and awareness, policy and procedure, updating your SSP, your POAM stuff, and how that can become one programmatic aspect around the system to reflect all of the policy and procedures there on how you have it built and system, and you have those two functions working together, right? Versus that being one person who's carrying basically all of the risk for your organization. So if we go to the next slide, that's exactly what we do at Beryllium InfoSec Collaborative. It's one of the ways that we help small businesses. This was done out of necessity, and we call it Quick Track. This was going back a couple years, way before the CMMC. We were very fortunate to work with companies that support the DoD, that wanted to get the requirements in place. They understood the importance of it, whether they were being pressured by their prime or not. They wanted to segment this data in this approach because they saw it as a practical and affordable way to do it versus kind of doing it themselves. So they said, you do what you're talking about, as we were out finding solutions for them and giving them real recommendations, not just copy and paste, but we have no problem saying, you know who's really good at this? NeQter Labs. They have a SIEM. You should implement that. You know who else is great at this? Virtru, who's, and some of these people I mentioned are going to be speaking in future webinars on this series. You know, multi-factor authentication, Duo, great resource for you. And even then they would say, we're a small business, we can't put this all together. So we said, okay, what if we do it this way that I just laid out? They said, yeah, do that. So we put that all together, and those key features on the right there are the things that people are out there searching for. They're whether they're reacting to CMMC or they're starting to understand that I have to get this stuff done, as Tom said with POAMs. It's a very daunting task for a lot of businesses to go down that list and try to get all of that. So those are all deliverables within the Quick Track program, and it's all in one package. I mean, it comes together and it comes in a very short period of time compared to doing it yourself over months and months and months, because the system already exists. People are already using it, and that policy, procedure, documentation, and proof is already there for you. So again, going back to the mindset of the green boxes and the blue boxes and putting them together, you know, this is how we felt if we were a small business, and let's say a small business hired us to go build this in their living room for them. It's exactly how we built it. NIST 800-171 is the Bible. This was not built to be enterprise. This was not built to be handling non-CUI. It's exactly what it's for. And we do it through a remote desktop so that it keeps the devices off of scope and only allow access to those that actually need it. If you don't handle CUI digitally, you don't need access to a system. You shouldn't be paying for that kind of stuff. So next slide, please. So to recap this a little bit, you know, put yourself in the shoes of a small business, whether you work with them or you are one, or you understand the importance here. Is I've got this machine, I've got my laptop at home, I'm on my couch, or maybe I'm in the office, and I need to work on CUI today. Maybe I don't have to tomorrow, but right now today I do. So I'm getting a VPN, full tunnel, secure access into that enclave so that it comes up on my desktop. Got the multi-factor authentication and all of that technical implementation in the background running, so that when you send and receive and store and save and whatnot through your CUI, it's in that remote desktop. And when you're done, you log out and you go back to your regular day, right? So now you're back in your regular network, no CUI, no infection. It's a practical way for sure. It's an affordable way because you're not having to stand up your own infrastructure or maybe pay for some expensive gov clouds who are really built sometimes for maybe some larger organizations. But the important thing is we really want to focus on technology first. It solves a lot of problems. So if we go to the next slide, I'll kind of showcase a trip down memory lane here for some people. Is that right? It was, okay, I need to have my SSP, I got to have my POAM, but I have to do my gap analysis first. I don't really know that we focused a lot on this. And now you have a gap. You have a very colorful report with some kind of cute little score on it that tells you have work to do. And that's where we were living before, and we can't live in that going forward. It has to be about getting this stuff into place. So imagine what a POAM looks like and an SSP looks like when that system is already done and you spend 15 minutes per user at the end of the day to implement them in. You've identified your scope. You get your 3, 5, 10, 15 people into that system. That focus on administrative and physical becomes a much more simple approach, right? Now you have the policy and procedures around the technology. You have your system security plan that shows a live living document on how this thing works and how it operates and how it's managed. You have a POAM that has some open items. Maybe if you haven't focused on physical yet, you'll have a POAM still, because you have to have labels, as you can see with physical copy. How is it carried around how are people, logged in and monitored through, and all these different things. And then you put that in, that becomes a way easier deal when you know that anytime it's outside of the system, this is how we handle it as an organization, or maybe we will handle it as an organization once we get our first DoD contract. We get those done, and now you're supplying and sending a really mature program to your customer or anybody that's looking to buy services from you. It's a managed compliance ongoing program at that point. And although POAMs are going to go away under CMMC, there's still some things that you might change as a business. What if you change facilities in your 3 years from a certification? What if you move a business unit over to another building and they now have to travel? All these different things are going to become an open POAM item. You just have to close them. So rather than having to worry about redoing the system and redoing access control and stuff, you then become really focus on the stuff that's caters specific to you, the business. And that's a huge piece of it, is that we have to have this, we have monthly calls with this, again, it's managed. We're not replacing anybody. We're becoming an extension of the team. And it just becomes a very practical way of doing it. Remote desktops are not a new concept. It's just that they weren't really developed most of the time for requirements like NIST standard 171. So if we go to the next slide, I'll wrap up here so we can spend a lot of time on Q&A, because I'm sure there's tons of questions. But how QuickTrack helps, again, this is as an affordable and practical way of doing this for small businesses, is it's a virtual enclave with a remote session, remote desktop that is now on your device, which helps you manage it and keep it ongoing from a compliance standpoint, because it combines the technology, administrative and physical, together so you don't have to. So this is the heavy lift from either one or maybe two people if a small business is fortunate to have enough people internally. That sleeping better at night feeling gets shifted off to somebody else, but it's not like it's a drop and run approach, which we see that in our industry too, where there's a lot of help on the front end, get a lot of support on the back end. It's a pretty scary thing. We get a lot of feedback from clients on, thought I knew this stuff until I kind of dug into it with you, and now I realize that I don't want to be the one in the news because China and Russia had a breach, and of my information, and it's all going to get pointed back to me, right? That's a collective, collaborative effort. That's why we have that in our name, and it's practical, affordable, and it's secure. And that's, if you're a small business trying to do work with the DoD and you're out looking for ways to get this done, and you're not factoring those three things in legitimately, apples to apples, you're going to set yourself up in some tough situations. So that's what we've done. We've done it out of necessity. It's one of the really cool ways that we help small businesses, and we're excited to work with Tim and all these and everyone that's been involved with these webinar series. We're very excited to actually help people out. So thank you, and I'm going to kick it back to Tim or Levi, whoever's going to run the Q&A, and we'll go from here.
Awesome. So thank you so much, both Derek, Tom. I know you guys shared a lot of great information, and as you guys were going through it, we got a lot of questions coming in. I know both of you touched a little bit about scoping, and the first question here actually dives a little bit into that. But in terms of scoping, say a company had multiple locations, and as far as the actual CMMC assessments go, would they need to get one simple assessment for just one location, or would it have to be assessments done for each and every single location within the company?
So this is Tom. I'll jump on that one. My understanding on the assessments is that it is on a company basis. That so it would be on a company that if you have multiple different locations, they would all technically be in scope. But this is where your data flow diagram, inventories, network diagram, because you may have multiple different locations, but they may not store, transmit, or process CUI, so there would be no reason for an assessor to actually go on site. So it's really about knowing where your data is and where your operations are.
That's a great answer. And going a little bit further into that, say the company had multiple domains. For their actual documentation, would you recommend having separate SSPs built out for each and every single one, or just one major SSP for the company as a whole?
No, actually, when you kind of look at an SSP really needs to be per contract. So if you have multiple different contracts, you're a sub on multiple, working either for the same prime or different primes, you need to build out an SSP for each one of those specific contracts, because while 90% of it may be the exact same thing, this is where you don't want to, take any chances, because again, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. So deal with every contract uniquely from an SSP perspective. Same with the network diagram with asset inventories, because scopings are always going to be slightly different.
So funny enough, this next question is actually something we were all discussing right before we hopped into the webinar. But there's been a lot of talk with CMMC about the fact that there is no such thing as a POEM being allowed with CMMC. Question goes a little bit further and goes, it should be viewed that you can't have any open POEM items at the time of the assessment, and having a POEM with a number of completed items on it shows maturity and improvement over time. So with that, what are your thoughts on having a POEM in CMMC?
Sure. Actually, I disagree with the concept that just showing items shows maturity over time. it shows the aspect of due care that you're actually identifying vulnerabilities and you're managing them. My pet peeve with what's going on with DoD and CMMC is that POAM should be allowed. Is that they really, they are good security practices, especially when you start looking at it from a manufacturing perspective. You may have a 10, 15, 20-year-old machine that is still viable, still works, but there could be, group accounts or something else on there that a compensating control would work, very well to, again, go back to that what controls do. They're meant to mitigate risks. Compensating controls could mitigate a lot of risks and be documented by a POAM. I just think it's really more political than it is actually, based on reality. Because if you go back through, DITS cap, die cap, RMF, basically you name it, compensating controls are allowed. They're industry accepted ways to essentially, apply compensating controls when you can't have a square peg for a square hole to meet the the immediate definition of what that control is asking for. So I have heartburn with that. I just think it's really misguided.
Yeah, and I know that's funny enough. We were, like I said right before the question, that's something we were talking about just a little before we hopped into this webinar. This next one, which I'll give to either one of you, but any general guidance for very small companies, say sub 20, maybe sub 15 personnel, that don't actually have the manpower and the resources to, personally go about with CMMC. Where do they begin with this? And I know this is something that Derek was talking a little bit about with QuickTrack, but what do you guys recommend?
Yeah, well, I can, Tom, I do want to hear your thoughts on that too. And, our position is going to always be, and I don't know if the situation here is they don't have the DoD business yet, or they're going to have it, or they do have it now, but scope still matters. So we have a lot of small businesses who, if they're really established and they've been around for a long time, it seems that there's a lot of shared resources, so there's a lot of people kind of within scope, but really focusing on that, on who actually needs to handle it and who doesn't. That's why QuickTrack was actually kind of developed the way that it was that out of those under 20 people, let's say, if only 8 or less really actually have to handle that documentation, or that CUI from a digital standpoint, let's identify that and then put them into an environment like that. Build the controls around them, whether you do it yourself, but it sounds like based on that question that there's not a lot of internal resources to do so. That makes things a lot simpler if you can shrink your scope and build around that. And if everybody does have to handle it for different reasons, then it's just following the data and finding the best ways in order to keep your business compliant, ongoing, and secure and whatnot. And a lot of that, obviously, if you're doing it yourself or you have a lot of moving parts, Tom's expertise on how to document that and go through that and reflect that for an auditor is super important. So we're always going to be scope first, and not just shrink it down because it saves cost, but shrink it down to who actually has to handle it in order for you to do the work that you're saying that you're going to do and be efficient on that. Because we want to try to keep it as business as usual as possible, but at the same time, change is important in order to keep costs down and keep scope where it needs to be.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think what Derek's company does is awesome. Companies should really go take a look at it. Shameless plug, but it works. But really, it kind of comes down to from a micro small perspective, or in any company, it could be small, medium, large. If one person isn't dedicated to owning CMMC, they're going to fail. I've written about it where essentially a lot of your MSPs are essentially the dumpster fire of CMMC. They can do really good work, but they're only going to be limited based on what the client is pushing them to do. And if the client isn't actually going and saying, I need you to do this, 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 and this, there's a good chance they're not going to do it. There are some good MSPs, and some people are probably swearing at me right now for saying that it's a dumpster fire. But the reality is, if you're not actively managing those requirements, even if it's a 5-person shop or 10-person shop, the reality is you're not going to pass it, because you can't outsource the ownership of all these controls, even with great products like with what Beryllium can do.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I didn't get super deep on, but that shared responsibility is very important, no matter if you're small or big. It's someone has to champion this thing. Someone should be, you should be proud of this. You should be, focused on the fact that you don't want this information, and forget our adversaries, think about your competition. You don't want this information leaking out so that you lose your advantage on this stuff either. But someone's got to champion that fact that this information, this compliance, this contract is all being protected. And there's things that the business has to do that you can't hire anybody to do unless you hire them full time to work for you, that needs to push this stuff forward. And that can be difficult. That's why it's a collaborative effort in our minds. And yeah, you're absolutely right, Tom. I think that's a
Well,
great point.
and actually, one thing to really kind of hit on that a lot of people just fail to realize is that that 800.171 CMMC are really good IT hygiene practices. There's really very little in there that's what you would consider hardcore cybersecurity requirements, and that's where it is attainable. But you have to focus on the basics. So you have to get the management, different lines of business, managers to understand that that it's a team effort, that it takes everyone to, like, if you're going to make a new product, they've got to plan for, budget, and implement, again, access control, all these other kind of things that maybe they really didn't think mattered all that much, but now they do. Otherwise, again, contracts will be lost, False Claims Act, liabilities will fly, all that good stuff.
Awesome. And I know we've talked a little bit about scoping and just exactly understanding where data resides, but this next question deals a little bit with it. But say a company has two locations, one within the US that has CUI and another in Mexico. Would the company be required to be level 3 for both locations? And I know this is something Tim and I have talked a little about. Tim, if you want to hop in as well.
Tim.
Well, while Tim's, I guess, getting off mute, one of the big things to identify in that one is, ITAR related data can be CUI. So it's verifying whatever is CUI is not ITAR, data. If you're talking, going to Mexico or any other non-US country. So it sounds like Tim might be back on, but that's a big thing to understand, is what your CUI actually is. Okay, sounds like Tim's mute button won't unmute there. But yeah, there are, for just straight vanilla CUI, there is no, from my understanding, you have to control the the information, but there is not a no foreign limitation like ITAR is. But you have to go through the same documentation, scoping, making sure that everything is properly scoped and controlled, regardless of the location.
Awesome. Next question coming up here. So CMMC isn't super clear on documentation requirements, and I know we've talked a little bit about a system security plan and plan of actions milestones, and Tom, you dived into it more with some of your slides. But why do you say we need all these documents, specifically including, like, say, an IRP or something like that?
Sure. So part of it is just taking more than just the talking points that might come from the DoD of like 110 controls. When you look at what's required in 800.171, is DFAR 7012, which that also requires you have instant response capabilities. So IRP specifically is a 7012 requirement that's not necessarily called out in 800.171 by itself. But the POAM, the SSP, those are called out. But then you actually look at what you can't, let's say get Derek to pop in here, so from a monitoring perspective, you can't just say, well, I bought a SIM, I've got monitoring, and I'm good, because it asks that question of like, okay, well, then again, from an auditor's perspective, it's like, okay, well, what defines what right looks like? It's going to be based on your policies, your standards, and procedures, how it's going to be configured, what is the documented secure configuration, all these other kind of things. That's where you have to think through what the requirements are and how do you prove it. That's why you have to have your policies, your standards, your procedures, SSP, your POAM, your data flow diagrams, all these other kind of things. Because again, you can't define what your scope is unless you have an accurate inventory, data flow diagrams, and essentially, network diagrams that show where everything is. Otherwise, technically everything is in scope. If you can't prove that your scope is smaller than your entire company, then your entire organization would then be in scope, and you have to prove it.
That's a great answer. And honestly, your example with monitoring, that one touches a little close to home, being with a SIM vendor. And it's something we tell our customers all the time of, hey, you can go out, you can purchase a SIM, but just having software in place doesn't mean that you guys are going to be compliant. It doesn't mean you're going to be keeping that CUI and FCI secure. It really comes down to, like you said, those business practices, having those policies, having those procedures in place.
Yeah, it's that two-sided coin, evidence of due care and due diligence. Essentially, what your products can do. You have evidence of due care. Okay, awesome, you got a SIM, but then you also have to have that evidence of due diligence of all that documentation that is setting the battlefield of your policy, standards, procedures. Again, acceptable use, mobile device management, all that other kind of stuff that essentially builds the the understanding of what right looks like for your company.
Yeah, and I'm real quick. I will say too. I think the due diligence and due care stuff. There's a lot of truth in believing and knowing right now that there's certification. There's we've seen this. You're gonna have to submit information, right? You're gonna have to submit assessments, all these different things. Where there's a lot of people under the DFAR 7012 life that we're kind of in this believing that we have everything in place, or believing that we're in good shape, believing that we have enough. But now it's to start knowing that, and knowing comes along with the due care and due diligence together, as Tom quickly highlighted. I think that was a great way to lay that out. Yeah, then I think anybody who's presenting on these webinars for the next couple weeks are really into that mindset, right? This isn't just about, hey, buy our stuff, plug it in, and watch the lights blink, and then, hey, I'm pretty sure we're good to go. This is about having it, showcasing it, documenting it, and preparing yourself for success under this stuff, for sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Just one thing on that too is that if you can't wake up in the morning and you're compliant, you're not compliant. It kind of goes back to you have to have that confidence in all that aspect of due care and due diligence, that it's all working together. So that you could, at any given time, you could essentially be considered audit ready or assessment ready. So it takes that level of knowing, like one person knowing how all the parts and pieces come together, and that that you're compliant. And again, that goes into it's not just that point in time. There's a lot of kind of wailing and gnashing of teeth on the interim rule that was published this week. There was a line in there about essentially maintaining CMMC status throughout the say the 3-year life of that certification. And people were questioning what maintaining actually means. Does that mean 100% compliance at all given times, which means you could potentially never change anything and then be deficient? So there was a lot of words do have meanings, and people are hopefully going to be bringing up and asking for clarification from the DoD on those type of things, just so there's that understanding of if I do upgrade things, if I upgrade new servers or new machinery, during that time of transition, what are my compliance obligations?
And I know you brought up the new DFARS rule a little bit right there. As far as that goes with the new DFARS rule and really the status of CMMC, can you guys talk a little bit more about what's going on right now? I know there's been some major updates these last few weeks.
Yeah, the interim rule. I mean, for the most part, I really don't think that there is that much active new development. I mean, the biggest thing, I mean, companies under 800.171 still have to have an SSP. They still have to have a POAM. It did document that CMMC exists, and it's a requirement. But the big thing was talking about having all primes and subs essentially having to now do self-attestations based on the DoD assessment methodology, the DAM, and then submitting that. That would then have a low, moderate, or high, basically, risk categorization from the DoD, that it would then either spawn, just DoD ignores it, or they potentially have DIB come out and assess that organization. That type of stuff is still not necessarily clear, but for the most part, it's business as usual.
So a little bit different of a question here. I know most of the questions so far have been really focused in. This one goes a little bit more specific into CMMC, and I think, Derek, this might be a good one for you, but VPN and multi-factor. So say the company's users have multi-factor to log into their computers. Does VPN still require that MFA when they would log in, say, from a remote environment?
Yes. Yep. So and really the answer to that is that you should be doing that anyway, probably across the organization as a whole. If you have people accessing a system from anywhere that's, let's say, like a on-premise, I mean, you should be having that additional step of authentication, because that is great security best practice for one, but also it just is the right thing to do. So yes, yep.
So say a company doesn't deal at all with CUI, according to the question. And I know as of right now with CUI, it's still a complicated thing to understand exactly what CUI is and what CUI isn't, specifically with how it's being marked. But say that the company doesn't have any CUI, would they still require CMMC certification if they're a DoD contracting company?
Required, no. Because if they don't have CUI, then they don't have to do CMMC. We're seeing a lot of companies that they want to obtain CMMC certification, either for a marketing perspective or potentially, one day they want to earn a a DoD contract. But yeah, if you don't store, transmit, or process CUI, you don't have to have a level 3 CMMC certification or go under like a DIB audit.
And I think over time, the goal, I think they've been saying this kind of since day one, is that when CMMC is fully implemented, then from a FCI standpoint and a basic level standpoint, that you'll have to be certified to that at some point to handle new business. But that's simple, more basic controls, and if that's the life you choose to live with DoD contract is level 1 forever because you never want to handle CUI, then that will be eventually something. I know what Tom you're saying from a level 3 standpoint, you're never going to need a level 3 if you don't handle CUI. So, but in order to be certified at some point in a level 1 in the future to then submit for business with the DoD over the next however many years it's going to take for CMMC to be fully rolled out, then I guess in the future, yes, you will need to be level 1 at minimum.
And going a little bit further off of that, I know, Tom, you mentioned this real quick, but taking the question from the other angle, say you don't have any DoD business yet, and as this moves on, you want to at least at some point begin taking in some DoD business. You're looking to achieve level 3. You want to have that CUI. What's a good way, say, if you're a smaller business, to get started on this? I know we've talked just a little bit about it, touched on it at some points during the webinar so far, but
Sure. No, it's a really great question, and we come across this, pretty regularly. So the idea is you really need to think through what your business plan is going to be. Are you going to manufacture something, or is it intellectual? Where is that CUI, future CUI going to be stored, transmitted, processed? And that's where you essentially want to build out an enclave, build out all the different controls, where you would protect that information, where it's again stored, transmitted, processed, how people will get in there, so that when you actually do get that contract, you can populate it with CUI and everything is already working, so you're not having to bolt on stuff after the fact. So basically build it out just like you think you already have that CUI and apply the controls from that perspective.
Yeah, and I'll jump in too. So I think to personally, this is the conversation we have a lot with our those that reach out or those that we meet in I don't do business with the DoD yet, but I want to, and I want to be prepared is a really tough spot right now than maybe it was a couple years ago going to the 7012 life, which was because if you don't have CUI yet and you want to be level 3, you're going to have a gap analysis against a bunch of controls you probably don't have in place, and that's not always a good look. If I think, Tom, you were hitting on this earlier on the communication internally, you go to your leadership and you say, look at all these things we have to do because we got a lot of reds on here, but it's because we haven't been focused on this, but we need to. That's an important piece. And when there are smaller companies, or let's just say a smaller scope, because if you're not doing DoD work yet, it's probably not going to take every single person in your organization to do the work and handle that data. That's again going back to scoping, but that's one way that QuickTrack is used, is that we have a couple people that are going to be handling this contract information. We want to show our prime, we want to show our customer, and the DoD that we have a robust system security plan. We have the policy and procedures in place. We understand where CUI will physically be within our organization based on what we know today. That kind of stuff is important, and then you can scale up from there, because as you grow your business and you grow your DoD work, scalable options are obviously very valuable. But yeah, at the end of the day, you have to understand, without doing the work, where is it going to come in? Is it business development? Is it whatever? Is it, if you're making something, we're talking quality, like where is this stuff going to go within, and how are we going to send it back out? And those conversations are just kind of front end, and hopefully we get some more clarity around what that's going to look like for those that are trying to get into this. But if you're aiming for level 3, it's a great approach, because you will differentiate yourself from a lot of other people over time. That you're telling the DoD that you want to handle this information, and I've made the investment, I'm buying into this thing. I'm ready to go. Please give it to me. And that's hopefully where we're going to get over the next couple of years on being a good, non-vulnerable piece of the link of the chain of the supply chain. So, yeah, I think that's well played out and a great question.
All right, and I know we only have a few minutes left. Tim, is your mic working?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Yep. I'll hand it back on over to you to wrap up a little and talk a little bit more about some of the upcoming events that we have planned. I know that this is the first in a series of a bunch of them celebrating Cyber Awareness Month, so
Okay.
take it away.
So kind of wrapping things up, we've got 4 more events coming up, one on every Friday through the rest of the month of October. The next one, of course, is October 9th. If you haven't signed up for any of these other events, it's the same link that you would have signed up for this first event. So you can go back to that link if you want to attend some of the other events. On October 9th, we're going to be talking about, specifically CMMC for small business, and then some different challenges and best practices. On the 16th, we're going to be talking with Duo specifically on, multi-factor authentication and how that, works in with the DIB and CMMC and 800.171. We're also going to touch on, backing things up if you're using GCC High, which a lot of DIB organizations are moving to, just because, it's Microsoft's government version of the an all-in-one Office 365 environment. On October 23rd, we're going to be talking about, safeguarding CUI. What is it really? Where is it? Do I have it? How do I know? And then we're going to be talking about a new way to do GRC tools and what's involved with that. And then on the final event on October 30th, we have a ton of topics. We even have someone from the CMMC AB who will be participating. That last event runs for, I believe it's 4.5 hours in total, and it will also have a Q&A. And if anyone has any questions about anything, please feel free to reach out to us. We will be providing these slides afterwards for anyone that needs them. This webinar has been recorded, so if anyone wants to go back and watch it again later, you can. And with all of that, we'll kind of wrap things up now. So again, thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at some of the future events. Thank you.